How's everybody doing? I'm here with Chapter 46, Book 1 of the Royal Rangers series, A New Beginning. Let's go ahead and get into it. Maddie crouched at the top of the path leading down to the beach. The kidnappers and the ship's crew were gathered in the mess tent, finishing their evening meal. The table was brightly illuminated by half a dozen lanterns. That'll make it easier to remain unseen, she thought. If the men were looking into the light cast by the lanterns, their night vision would be ruined. Most of them were seated round the table. Donald and Thomas, the two men who had been in the camp when she and Will first arrived, prepared and served the meal. They then sat on the ground with their own food, a few meters away from the fire. The kidnappers and the sailors seemed to be in good spirits. Their conversation was noisy and animated, and laughter broke out frequently. She guessed they had good reason to be content. They had taken 10 captives to take off to the Socoran slave markets. The moon rose over the ocean, bathing the water in silver light. The black outline of the ship stood out in stark contrast. Water was lapping around the hull, and the ship was no longer canted to one side. Maddie noted that the captives in the cave hadn't been fed. Presumably, they were given only one meal a day. Rule wasn't the type to waste money feeding his prisoners more than they needed to stay alive. She waited, squinting at the moon with her hand held out at an arm's length, until it was 4 finger widths above the horizon. That was the time she had agreed with Will. By now, he'd be making his way down the cliffs on the northern headland of the bay. She moved in a crouch to the beginning of the path. She paused, checking the men in the mess tent once more. But they were busy eating, and judging by the raucous laughter that came more frequently with each passing minute, they were drinking as well. She set her bow to one side. It would only be a hindrance as she made her way down the path, and in the dark she'd probably need both hands free. She wound the sling around her right hand and started down the track to the beach. The footing was uneven, and she went slowly, testing each step. Once she was below the level of the cliff top, she would be all but invisible against the dark cliff face. But if she were to slip and fall, the chances were high that she'd be heard, and someone might come looking to see what had caused the noise. Her foot slipped as she stepped on a loose layer of pebbles. Several of them clattered over the edge of the path, bouncing off the rocks below. She froze, her heart in her mouth. To her, the skittering pebbles sounded as loud as an avalanche. Her left hand went to the shot pouch, ready to select and load a lead ball into the sling. She waited a full minute, but there was no sign that anyone had heard her. Taking even greater care, she set off again, a black, uneven shadow sliding slowly downward, barely visible against the dark background of the cliff. She reached the first switchback where the path angled back on itself. The ground was rough and strewn with small boulders here, and she picked her way carefully around the turn. She glanced back over her shoulder at the mess tent. The slavers were still intent upon their food and drink. A loud burst of laughter rang out. "Keep making noise," she said under her breath. "That way you won't hear me." The second stretch of the track was more even underfoot. She'd been crouching on the rougher ground higher up to maintain her balance, but now she straightened and moved faster until she reached the second switchback. She picked her way carefully around it. There was only 20 meters to go now, and she'd be at the bottom. She forced herself to concentrate. With the end of the track in sight, it was tempting to relax and rush. Yet she continued her slow, careful pace, crouching once more, feeling the ground twist underfoot as she stepped on larger rocks, occasionally sinking into unexpected dips and ruts in the track. One was deeper than it looked, and she jarred her back as she stepped into it. She grunted in surprise, then froze. To her, the involuntary noise had sounded as loud as a shout. But there was no reaction from the men at the mess table, and she continued, finally stepping down onto the level ground at the foot of the track. Now she had to wait once more. As Will had once described it to her, a ranger's day seemed to be made up of hours of waiting, followed by a few minutes of frantic, frightening action. She waited now for those frantic minutes to come. Her stomach was a tight knot. The tension was almost unbearable. She had no idea whether Will had reached the rocks at the base of the northern cliff yet. He could have fallen and injured himself. If the path he had found was anything like the one she traversed, one incautious step could have left him lying with a broken ankle, or unconscious. The longer she waited, the worse the picture in her imagination became. What would she do if Will didn't fulfill his part of the plan? If he was incapacitated somewhere on that cliff path? How could she get the children away? It was too late to go for help. Ambleton was the nearest settlement of any size. By the time she got there, and brought help back to Hawkshead Bay, the slavers and the children would be long gone, heading for the Socoran slave market and a life of misery. Could she somehow set fire to the ship, then double back up the beach to release the children? She discarded the idea almost as soon as she thought of it. The chances that she could make it across the beach unobserved were slim to none, and she needed Will to draw off the pursuit to the south while she got the children away safely. She thought of another option. She had 24 arrows in her quiver, and there were 18 men sitting around the table. She could simply start shooting at them. She'd take them by surprise, possibly drive them off in panic. Then she considered the plan realistically. She might get 2 of them, even 3 if she was fast enough. But they weren't simple villagers to be frightened off by a surprise attack out of the darkness. They were ruthless men with an investment to protect. They were armed and, she assumed, experienced fighting men. They'd go to ground, taking cover behind the tents on the table, or the large rock outcrops that dotted the beach. Then they'd begin to move to outflank her, and sooner or later she'd be overwhelmed. Besides, she thought bitterly, she had left her bow at the top of the cliff. She sighed. There was nothing she could do if Will didn't make it to the rocks on the south side of the cove. She'd have to watch helplessly while the children were herded aboard the ship and taken away. Then she saw it, a flash of light, briefly visible among the dark jumble of distant rocks. Will must have opened the shutter on his dark lantern to light one of the fire arrows. It was gone as he closed the shutter. But now she thought she could see a pinpoint of light among the rocks. She realized it was the glowing tip of one of the fire arrows. She glanced back fearfully at the slavers, but they were sitting in a circle of bright light and hadn't noticed the brief flash from the rocks. As she watched, the yellow pinpoint arced up into the night sky, then curved toward the black ship. It seemed to strike close to the base of the mast. There it remained, still visible, but not growing any larger for the moment. It must have hit in a clear section of deck, where there was nothing flammable to catch alight. The arrow would burn itself out, and the ship would remain unharmed. She cursed silently. Another pinpoint briefly soared, then descended. This one traveled on a higher arc that seemed to end in the middle of the vessel's loosely furled sail. And this time it was seen by one of the slavers. What was that? The blue-cloaked figure of the storyman, who was sitting facing the ocean, suddenly sat up straight, pointing toward the ship. Rule looked at him with idle curiosity. "What?" he demanded. He was replete with good food and wine, and not in the mood to be disturbed. The storyman continued pointing, and the others turned casually to look at what he was indicating. "It was a light," he said, "looked like a falling star, and it came down on the ship. There's another." He added the last 2 words in a shout as a third fire arrow soared briefly across the cove. Even as it struck near the base of the mast, the yellow flames suddenly flared in the sail, as Will's previous shot finally ignited the tarred canvas. "Fire arrows!" the Iberian captain shouted. "Someone's trying to burn La Bruja!" Chairs crashed over backwards as the men leapt to their feet. The Iberian crew were the first to react, sprinting across the sand to save their ship. Another source of flame was visible at the base of the mast now. Then, a 4th point of light soared across the sky and struck the side of the hull. The fires in the sail and at the base of the mast were burning steadily, but they were yet to attain the fierce, uncontrollable rage that would spell the end of the ship. An unbidden memory of her Iberian classes strayed into Maddie's mind as she watched. La Bruja, the witch, she murmured. That was the name of the ship. "Help us!" The Iberian captain stopped and yelled at the slavers, who were standing uncertainly by the table. He beckoned furiously with his arms, waving them to follow. Already, his own crew had reached the ship, and were dashing seawater on the flames at the base of the mast. The burning sail, gradually beginning to burn with more intensity, was out of their reach. "If we lose the ship, we lose everything," he shouted, and that seemed to penetrate the stasis that gripped Rule and his men. "Come on," the Stealer shouted, and led them running down to the ship. The captain was yelling at his men, ordering them to let the yardarm with its burning sail fall, then smother the flames with buckets of water. As they did, another fire arrow hissed down, landing in the bow of the ship, where coils of tarred rope were lying ready for use. The flames shot up, licking at the tar, melting it, then igniting it. "Put that out!" the captain yelled at Rule and his men. His own crew almost had the burning sail under control. As Matty watched, they heaved a still burning remnant over the side into the sea. There was an immense hiss and a cloud of steam. Realizing that there was nobody paying any attention to the campsite, she darted out from the shadows and ran toward the mess tent with its abandoned table and overturned chairs. In her haste, she went to the wrong upright and had a moment of panic when she saw that there were no keys hanging there. Then she reoriented herself and saw them hanging on the next post. She seized them and turned toward the cave. In the bow of the ship, the coil of rope had begun to burn fiercely, and the flames spread to a spare sail furled and stowed along the bulwark. Rule and his men beat at the flames with their jackets and cloaks. Unfamiliar with the layout of the ship, they didn't know where to lay their hands on the buckets that the sailors were using. The captain realized this and sent 2 of his men forward, laden with 6 buckets. The men began to hurl seawater on the flames, slowly bringing them under control. Rule searched frantically for the source of the arrows. "Who's shooting at us?" he screamed in fury. As he said the words, another arrow hissed down, but this wasn't a fire arrow. It was a war arrow, and it buried itself in the chest of the man beside him. The slaver staggered under the impact of the heavy shaft, then fell across the burning sail, extinguishing some of the flames. Rule looked around in time to see another fire arrow arc up from the rocks. It was Will's final fire arrow, but there was no way the panicked men on the ship could know that. "They're in the rocks at the base of the cliff," Rule shouted, pointing to the spot where he'd seen that curving light begin. He felt the deck of the ship lurch under him, and looked around to see the captain severing the anchor rope with a small axe. La Bruja began to move. Rule ran down the deck, grabbing the captain's arm. "What are you doing? Are you mad?" The captain glared at him. His face was smeared with ash from the burning sail, and his arm was red and blistered where the flames had seared him as he had helped throw it overboard. He was in no mood to argue with Rule. He knew how quickly fire could claim his ship. "I'm getting her out of danger. She's a sitting duck here, and I'm not risking her." The ebbing tide was moving the ship faster and faster. Rule looked around in desperation. "They're in the rocks," he shouted. "The archers are in the rocks. We can catch them." "Then do so. I'll leave 2 of my men with you." The captain glanced down the deck, assessing his crew. "Enrico, Anselmo, go with Senor Rule." He looked back at Jory Rule. "You'd better go if you're going. We'll return tomorrow." Rule hesitated a moment, then came to a decision. He leapt over the bulwark, landing in waist-deep water, yelling at his men to follow. He heard a series of splashes behind him as he waded ashore. Glancing back, he saw his men and the 2 Iberian sailors forcing their way against the tide behind him. He staggered onto dry sand, then stumbled, saving his life. An arrow sliced through the air just over his head. He looked at the rocks. He had no idea how many archers were hidden there, but he realized that he and his men were armed with nothing but knives. "Get your weapons!" he shouted, as an arrow slammed into the upper arm of the man nearest him. The slaver cried out in pain, but it was a glancing blow, and the arrow tore free. One of his companions quickly bound the flesh wound with his neck scarf. "He's okay," he called to Rule. The Stealer nodded, then crouched in an unwitting attempt to avoid further arrows, led his men up the beach to the camp. All right, and that is it for Chapter 45. Thank you for joining me. Pardon me, Chapter 46. Thank you to everybody for joining me. I'll see you next time in Chapter 47. God bless and have a good one.